It was a typical morning in the small town of Westbridge, a place where everyone knew everyone, and the pace of life was slow enough that even the most minor event could become the talk of the town. Officer Michael Thompson had worked the beat for over a decade, his routine as predictable as the sunrise. Every day, he put on his uniform, checked in with the precinct, and went on his patrol, greeting familiar faces and ensuring everything remained in order. The town itself seemed to thrive on its familiarity, where the quiet streets were lined with local shops, families knew each other by name, and the community was tight-knit. It was the kind of place where a police officer could easily become a pillar of the community, where people trusted you, and you trusted them in return. Michael had always been a good officer, conscientious, respectful, and dependable. He was well liked by most, though he often found himself outside of the tight social circles that formed within the town. He was known for keeping a low profile, doing his job well, but never drawing attention to himself. His life was steady, unremarkable, and perfectly content in its ordinary simplicity. That morning, as he drove through the quiet streets of Westbridge, Michael glanced at his watch, just a few more hours left on his shift before heading home. The sun had barely risen, casting a warm golden hue over the town. He drove past the usual landmarks, the local diner, the school, the park where the kids played after school, and then, as he reached the edge of town, he saw it. The tall, stately house of Commissioner David Green. The commissioner was a man of great influence in Westbridge. A political figure who had worked hard to build both his career and reputation, he and his wife, Eleanor, were the epitome of the town's upper class. Their home was nestled just outside of the town center, a sprawling estate that looked like something out of a history book. The commissioner had long been a figure of authority, not just in the local government but in every facet of life in Westbridge. People respected him, some feared him, and others simply adored him. Eleanor, his wife, was as graceful as she was powerful, a woman who could turn heads with a single glance. It wasn't that Michael had ever interacted much with Eleanor Green, she was, after all, the commissioner's wife, but everyone in town had an opinion about her. Her beauty and composure made her a constant subject of admiration, and her kindness to the community was always noted. But there were rumors, whispers in the darker corners of the town, that suggested there was more to Eleanor than met the eye. She was a woman who rarely showed any sign of vulnerability, yet there were moments when even the most casual observer could sense an underlying sadness, a quiet unease that never quite left her. On this particular day, as Michael continued his patrol, he passed the commissioner's home and caught a glimpse of Eleanor on the front porch. She was standing there, looking out over the vast estate, seemingly lost in thought. Michael had never spoken to her directly, but there was something in the way she stood, still, poised, yet somehow distant, that caught his attention. Michael hadn't planned on stopping. He had other duties to attend to, and he had always respected the commissioner's family's privacy. But for some reason, today felt different. There was a strange tug in his gut, an instinct that told him something was about to unfold. Maybe it was his curiosity, or maybe it was the fact that he had never seen Eleanor out on the porch at this hour, but Michael slowed his patrol car and pulled to a stop across the street. For a moment, he just sat there, observing her, unsure of what to do next. She seemed unaware of his presence, lost in her own thoughts. And then, something shifted. A car pulled up the long driveway, a sleek black vehicle that Michael immediately recognized. It was the commissioner's. The sight of it instantly reminded him of his duty and the boundaries that had always kept him at a respectful distance from the Green family. He should drive on, continue his rounds, and avoid intruding on their personal lives. But as the car came to a stop, Michael's gaze locked with Eleanor's. Her expression softened, and for a split second, he could have sworn there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. It wasn't a look of warmth or gratitude. It wasn't even a smile. It was something far more complex, a fleeting moment that seemed to say she knew him, not personally, but in a way that only the people of a small town could understand. It was the kind of look that spoke volumes without uttering a word. Michael quickly turned away, his heart beating faster than usual. He told himself it was nothing, just a passing moment that meant nothing at all. Yet, the encounter left him unsettled. He tried to shake it off as he continued his patrol, but the image of Eleanor's eyes lingered in his mind. He had no idea that this brief, seemingly insignificant moment would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would forever alter his life, and the lives of everyone in Westbridge. As the day wore on, Michael's patrol continued as usual. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the town remained blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to hit. But within the walls of the commissioner's house, things were not as calm as they seemed. Eleanor's thoughts were far from peaceful, and the tension in the air was palpable. In the hours to come, Michael would be forced to confront a decision that would change everything. But for now, as he drove down the quiet streets of Westbridge, he couldn't have known that his routine was about to shatter in the most unexpected way. The wheels of fate had already begun to turn, and all Michael could do was brace for the consequences of the choices yet to be made. The following days seemed to pass by without incident, though Michael couldn't shake the odd feeling that had settled into his chest since that brief moment with Eleanor Green. It wasn't something he could explain, it was as if something had shifted in the air, a change so subtle that no one else would notice. But Michael felt it, an undercurrent of tension that made his usual routines feel unfamiliar, somehow charged. It wasn't as if he had any reason to think about the commissioner's wife beyond the fleeting interaction they'd had, but there was something about her expression that kept tugging at his mind. That Friday afternoon, Michael was finishing up his patrol when he saw her again. Eleanor was standing outside, this time near the garden by the front gate. She was bending over, inspecting some of the plants, flowers, perhaps, or shrubs that lined the pathway leading to the house. Michael slowed his car instinctively as he approached, but this time, instead of driving past, he found himself pulling to the side of the road. He could feel his pulse quicken as he parked and stepped out of the car. Eleanor was absorbed in her task, her back turned toward him. It felt almost surreal to be standing there, watching her like this. He had never spoken to her before, yet there was something almost magnetic about the way she carried herself. Her long, dark hair was tied back, and she wore a simple, yet elegant dress, her usual grace and composure evident even in such an ordinary moment. But Michael could sense that there was more beneath the surface, something that made the woman before him seem distant and unreachable. His feet moved before he could fully think about it. Slowly, he approached her, keeping his steps quiet. As he drew closer, Eleanor straightened up from her task and looked up, her eyes immediately locking with his. There was no surprise, no visible startle in her expression, only a calm acknowledgement. "Officer Thompson," she said softly, her voice carrying a smooth, refined quality that Michael had heard many times before in passing conversations. But now, standing face to face with her, the words held a weight that he hadn't anticipated. "Ma'am," Michael replied, his voice a bit shakier than he intended. He forced himself to remain composed, but there was something disarming about her calm demeanor. He cleared his throat. "Beautiful day." "Yes," Eleanor replied, her gaze never wavering from his. "It's peaceful here, away from everything. Sometimes, I think the world moves too quickly." Michael wasn't sure what to say. The small talk felt awkward, but it also felt important, like the first step in breaking down the invisible barrier that had always existed between them. For a brief moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the quiet thick in the air. It wasn't uncomfortable, exactly, just heavy with unspoken words. Michael wasn't sure why, but the tension in the air made him feel as though something was about to happen. Something that would change everything. "I've seen you around the precinct," Eleanor continued, her voice gentle yet inquisitive. "You're always so reserved. You're not much of a talker, are you?" Michael chuckled nervously, trying to ease the awkwardness. "I suppose I'm just focused on the job." She nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. But then, as quickly as it appeared, her smile faded. There was a new intensity in her eyes, one that made Michael take a step back in his mind. It wasn't fear, no, there was something else there. Something that Michael couldn't quite name. "I'm sure it's difficult sometimes," Eleanor said, her voice growing more serious. "Being in a position of authority, of responsibility. You must carry the weight of things that others don't see." She paused, as if weighing her words. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like to just break free from it all?" The question hung in the air between them, and Michael found himself at a loss for words. The calm and measured woman before him had just revealed a hint of something raw, something vulnerable. And for a brief, fleeting moment, Michael saw a different side of her, the woman behind the public image, the commissioner's wife who everyone admired from a distance, but no one truly knew. Before he could respond, a car pulled into the driveway, and Eleanor's expression shifted instantly. Her face, once soft and contemplative, hardened into its usual composed mask. Michael felt the change, as though an invisible wall had gone up between them. The vehicle that had just arrived was unmistakable, the sleek black car of her husband, Commissioner David Green. Michael didn't know what had transpired between them in the past, nor did he know what kind of relationship they had. But from the brief glimpse he had gotten of Eleanor, he couldn't ignore the sense that something was not right. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift in her demeanor when the car arrived had him second-guessing everything he had thought about her. "Excuse me," Eleanor said, her voice curt now, as she turned toward the house. "I must go. My husband is home." Michael stepped back, watching her as she walked toward the door, her movements graceful but deliberate. As the door closed behind her, the moment was over, and the tension that had hung in the air slowly dissipated, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts. But that brief encounter had left him unsettled. Eleanor's words, the rawness he glimpsed in her eyes, and the sudden change in her demeanor when her husband arrived, they all seemed to hint at something deeper, something hidden just beneath the surface. Something Michael was now drawn to understand. Little did he know that the choices he made in the coming days would force him to confront not just the mysterious layers of the commissioner's wife, but also the moral boundaries of his own actions. What started as a casual exchange had already set the stage for an event that would shake the very foundations of the small town, and Michael would soon find himself caught in the middle of a storm he could never have anticipated. And the worst part? He still didn't realize how far the consequences would stretch, or how they would change the lives of everyone involved, himself included. The days that followed felt like a slow march toward an inevitable collision, though Michael had no idea just how fast the wheels of fate were turning. As he continued with his duties, his thoughts remained unexpectedly preoccupied with the encounter at the Green estate. His conversations with fellow officers and townspeople seemed to blur into background noise as his mind often drifted back to the brief, quiet moment with Eleanor. There was something about her, a sense of loneliness that lingered just beneath the surface, a feeling of entrapment in a life she couldn't fully control, no matter how composed she appeared to be. And yet, even as he tried to dismiss the thoughts, something about the way her eyes met his, full of unspoken tension, wouldn't leave him. It wasn't long before Michael's instincts began to pick up on a growing sense of unease in the town. At first, it was subtle. People started whispering, conversations turning quieter as they passed the police precinct. There was a shift in the air, an unspoken fear that hung over Westbridge like a cloud, one that wasn't present before. It wasn't as though anything specific had happened, not yet at least. But something had shifted within the walls of the Green household, and the town was starting to feel it. Michael couldn't ignore it. He knew the Greens well enough by reputation. Commissioner Green was a man of great stature and influence in Westbridge, commanding the respect of most. His authority extended far beyond his official role, and his word was often law. But Michael had always respected him, even if the commissioner's power sometimes felt oppressive. He didn't like the idea of stepping into the personal life of another man, especially someone as respected as Green. Yet, as the days wore on, Michael began to question whether that respect was enough to keep him from looking closer at what was going on. One night, while on his usual patrol, Michael received a call that would change everything. It came through the radio, a terse, urgent dispatch from the precinct. "Officer Thompson, we have a 10-31 at the Green residence. Officer assistance required immediately. Repeat, officer assistance required." The radio crackled with static, but the message was clear. Michael's heart began to race as he swung the patrol car around and headed toward the Green estate. He arrived to find a flurry of activity surrounding the house. Lights flashed in the distance, and multiple squad cars were already parked in the driveway. It wasn't just any emergency, this was serious. He parked quickly, throwing his door open and hurrying toward the front steps. As he approached, he could see that the commissioner was standing outside, his posture rigid with frustration, his face taut with anger. His eyes, sharp and cold, locked onto Michael as he approached. "What's going on here, sir?" Michael asked, his voice steady despite the confusion racing through his mind. The commissioner's gaze flickered toward him for a moment before he nodded toward the door. Inside, he barked. "It's Eleanor. Something's gone wrong." Without another word, Michael followed him into the house. The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of unspoken words suffocating. As they entered the spacious foyer, Michael's eyes immediately locked onto Eleanor. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her face pale and strained. Her usual composure was gone, replaced by something far more fragile. "What happened?" Michael asked, his voice soft yet firm, trying not to intrude too much on the family's privacy, but unable to ignore the clear distress in the room. Eleanor's eyes, bloodshot and filled with an emotion Michael had never seen from her, met his. For a brief moment, she seemed to hesitate before speaking. "It was him," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It was Officer Harris." Michael felt a cold shiver run through him. Officer Harris? Michael had known Harris for years. He was a fellow officer in the department, someone with a spotless record, an upstanding officer who had earned the town's trust. But as Eleanor's words sank in, Michael felt a sense of disbelief. What could have happened to lead Officer Harris to this point? The commissioner stepped forward, his voice harsh. "You don't understand, Michael. Harris has been stalking my wife for months. I've been trying to handle this quietly, private, discreet, but tonight he crossed the line." Michael's mind raced. Harris, a man he had known and worked alongside for years, had been involved in something so sinister? He couldn't fathom it. The officer he had known was dedicated to his work, his reputation impeccable. And yet here they were, standing in the middle of this chaos, with a story too unbelievable to ignore. "Where is he now?" Michael asked, his jaw tight with determination. "He's gone," the commissioner answered, his voice laced with anger. "But the damage is done. Eleanor, she's terrified." Michael's gaze shifted back to Eleanor. She was staring at her hands, her face a mixture of fear and shame. He could tell that the weight of what had just happened was suffocating her. The air in the room felt thick, as though the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. "You need to get some rest," Michael said gently, though he knew this wasn't going to end here. The magnitude of what had happened, what was still happening, hung over them all like a storm cloud waiting to burst. For a moment, Eleanor nodded slowly, but then she looked up at him, her eyes filled with an emotion Michael couldn't quite place. "I'm not safe, Michael," she whispered. "I don't know who I can trust anymore." And in that moment, something inside Michael clicked. Everything about the way Eleanor had behaved, the way she had looked at him, the hesitation in her voice when she spoke of Harris, it all started to make sense. This wasn't just about one officer crossing a line. This was about something much deeper, something Michael had barely begun to understand. The life Eleanor had been living, the quiet, seemingly perfect life, was a lie. As Michael left the greenhouse that night, his mind was spinning. He had always believed in justice. He had always upheld the law and trusted his colleagues to do the same. But now, standing on the edge of this revelation, Michael realized he was facing a moral dilemma that could shatter everything he thought he knew about right and wrong. In the coming days, Michael would find himself drawn deeper into the Green family's secrets. As he navigated the dangerous waters of power, deceit, and betrayal, he would have to make decisions that would change not only his life but the lives of those around him. And as the truth about Officer Harris's involvement began to unfold, Michael would have to come to terms with the fact that even the most trusted people in his life had their own hidden agendas. The lines between right and wrong were blurring, and Michael Thompson was about to find himself trapped in a storm that would test his every belief about duty, loyalty, and justice. He could never have imagined that a simple patrol and a chance encounter with Eleanor Green would lead him down this dark, twisted path. And now, with no way of turning back, Michael had to decide where his loyalties truly lay. The following days felt like a blur to Michael as he tried to process everything that had happened. He found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the town, about the people around him, and about the very nature of trust. His interactions with his fellow officers began to feel strained, and he couldn't shake the nagging sense that something was terribly wrong. Michael had always believed in the integrity of the police force. After all, it was his duty, his livelihood, and the life he had built. But the darker layers of the story that had unfolded before him had left him uncertain of whom he could trust, and whom he should be wary of. Officer Harris, once a colleague he respected, was now a name wrapped in suspicion. The accusations were chilling. Had Harris been stalking Eleanor Green, the commissioner's wife, for months? The pieces were starting to come together in a way that left Michael feeling dizzy, but there was still so much he didn't understand. The more he tried to find answers, the deeper the questions seemed to go. Harris's disappearance after the incident only added to the chaos. No one knew where he had gone, and the town was beginning to whisper about possible cover-ups, hidden alliances, and a conspiracy that might stretch far beyond the bounds of the Green household. But even as the investigation into Harris's actions continued, Michael's mind kept returning to Eleanor. What had she meant when she said she didn't feel safe anymore? What was it about her words, about the way she looked at him with such raw vulnerability, that struck him to his core? There was more to this story, so much more than anyone could have anticipated. And he couldn't help but feel that Eleanor was keeping something from him, some key piece of the puzzle that would make everything make sense. As the days wore on, Michael became more and more consumed by this case. His patrols, once a mundane routine, had turned into a never-ending search for clues, answers, and something that could provide him with the truth. The small town of Westbridge, which had once seemed so tranquil and predictable, was now a place of uncertainty and fear. People began to avoid him on the streets, their eyes darting away whenever he passed. He had become a part of the story, an unwitting player in a drama that was far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. One evening, after finishing his shift, Michael sat in his car outside the precinct, staring out into the empty parking lot. His mind was a swirl of conflicting thoughts. He knew he needed to keep digging, to uncover the truth. But every step forward seemed to lead him further down a path he wasn't sure he could return from. He thought back to the moments he had shared with Eleanor, their brief but intense conversation, the way she had looked at him as if she were searching for something he couldn't give her. Was she in danger? Had she been part of something more sinister than he could understand? And most importantly, why had she chosen him to confide in, of all people? Was he simply a convenient person in a vulnerable moment, or was there more to their connection than he realized? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock on his window. He jumped, startled, but relaxed when he saw it was Lieutenant Harris, the department's highest-ranking officer. The man's presence was imposing, his eyes cold and sharp. He wasn't the type to engage in small talk, and Michael felt the weight of his gaze immediately. "You been thinking about this case too much?" Lieutenant Harris asked, his voice low and clipped. Michael didn't respond right away, but eventually nodded. There's something off about all this. Something we're not seeing. The lieutenant sighed and leaned against the car, his gaze distant. It's a mess, I'll give you that. But you need to be careful, Thompson. You're treading into waters you don't fully understand. You've got to remember who you're dealing with. Green runs this town, and anyone who gets in his way, even indirectly, is going to face consequences. Michael's chest tightened at the mention of Commissioner Green. The commissioner had been a figure of power and influence in the town for as long as Michael could remember. Everyone respected him, and no one ever dared question his authority. But now, Michael wasn't sure whether Green was just a victim in this situation, or whether he was playing a far more dangerous game behind the scenes. I'm not going to back off, Michael said, his voice more determined than he felt. I need to know the truth. The lieutenant met his gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly. Just remember, sometimes the truth isn't something you can handle. If you keep digging into this, you're not just risking your career, you're risking your life. Michael didn't respond. He couldn't. The weight of his words sank in, and for the first time, Michael truly understood what he was up against. This wasn't just a case about one officer's misdeeds, it was about something much larger, something with far-reaching consequences. The higher-ups in the department, the commissioner, and possibly even people within the town's government, everyone had a stake in the game. And as Michael began to understand, not everyone wanted the truth to come out. The next day, Michael was summoned to the commissioner's office. He hadn't been expecting the call, but it came with an urgency that he couldn't ignore. As he walked into the office, he saw the familiar face of Commissioner Green sitting behind his desk, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Michael wondered what he had walked into, and whether he was being led into a trap. "Take a seat, Thompson," Green said, motioning to the chair in front of him. "We need to talk." Michael obeyed, his instincts telling him that the conversation ahead would be one that would define the next steps in his life. The tension in the room was thick, and Michael could feel the eyes of the commissioner on him, probing, assessing. "I know you've been looking into Harris," Green began, his voice calm but firm. "And I know you've been talking to my wife." Michael stiffened but didn't interrupt. He wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but he already felt the weight of the commissioner's words bearing down on him. "I need to know where your loyalty lies, officer," Green continued, his tone sharpening. "If you're going to continue investigating Harris, I suggest you do it quietly. If not, you'll find yourself in a position you're not prepared for." The subtle threat in the commissioner's words hung in the air, and Michael's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just about finding out the truth, it was about survival. He had been warned. Now, Michael was faced with a choice: keep digging and risk everything, or back down and protect the life he had built. As he sat there, weighing his options, Michael realized that this was no longer just about justice. It was about power, manipulation, and the lengths people would go to protect their secrets. He had already crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The game had changed, and Michael was now a player in a much larger, much more dangerous game. Michael didn't sleep well that night. The conversation with Commissioner Green echoed in his mind, reverberating with the unspoken threat that lingered in the commissioner's tone. Michael had always prided himself on his ability to maintain a sense of honor, to uphold the law, no matter the circumstances. But now, it felt like everything he believed in was slipping through his fingers. There were no clear lines in this case, no sense of right and wrong. Every choice he made from here on out could be his undoing. He had seen the power Green wielded, felt the weight of his presence, and now, Michael was trapped between duty and survival. But as the hours ticked by, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was being pulled deeper into a web of deceit, manipulation, and lies that would ultimately consume him. The next morning, Michael gathered himself and went back to work, though his mind was far from focused. Each case he reviewed seemed insignificant compared to the storm brewing around him. He had heard rumors around town, whispers of things people had seen and heard, but none of them were concrete enough to act upon. His trust in the people around him was starting to erode. The officers who had once been colleagues, friends even, seemed to avoid his gaze when he passed them in the hall. Was it guilt? Fear? Or something darker that they knew and Michael didn't? The quiet mutterings from his fellow officers suggested they were in on something he hadn't fully grasped, and that thought gnawed at him. He had to find out what was really going on. By midday, Michael received a phone call that would set everything in motion. It was from a local informant who had always been a reliable source of information in the past. The voice on the other end was shaky, anxious. "You need to meet me, Thompson," the informant said. "It's about Harris. It's not what you think. You're in over your head, and if you don't act soon, it won't just be Harris you have to worry about." Michael's pulse quickened. He had been expecting some sort of breakthrough, but this felt different. Something in the informant's voice made it clear that what he was about to learn would change everything. Without hesitation, Michael agreed to meet at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. The air in the diner was thick with secrecy, the hum of conversation fading as Michael's eyes scanned the room. He spotted the informant in the back corner, looking nervously over his shoulder as he sipped a coffee that had long gone cold. When Michael slid into the seat opposite him, the informant didn't waste time. "You need to know something," he said in a low voice, his hands shaking slightly. "It's not just Harris. It's Green. He's been covering for him. But it goes deeper than that. Harris didn't act alone. He's been part of a larger plan, one that Green has been orchestrating for years." Michael's mind raced as the informant continued. "Harris was never just a cop. He's been an enforcer, working with Green to intimidate people, silence them if they knew too much. But Eleanor, your connection with her? That's what triggered everything. She knows too much, and now they're both caught in a game that's beyond anyone's control." Michael felt the world shift beneath him. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they painted was more terrifying than he could have imagined. The commissioner, a man who had been a pillar of authority in the town, was not just a leader, he was a puppet master, pulling strings from the shadows. And Eleanor? She wasn't just a victim caught in the crossfire. She was a key player in a much larger story, one that could unravel everything Michael had believed about his life, his town, and the people he had trusted. "I don't know if I can trust you," Michael said, the weight of the decision settling over him. "How do I know this isn't just another lie to throw me off?" The informant leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because Green has eyes everywhere. He's been watching you. He knows you've been digging. You're not just a cop in his town anymore, you're a threat." The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. Green wasn't just using his power to manipulate the system, he was using it to control everything, even the people meant to enforce the law. Michael had become a part of that system, unwillingly, and now, there was no escape. As Michael sat there in stunned silence, the informant slipped something across the table, a folder, thick with documents. "Everything you need to know is in here. But be careful. If Green finds out you have it, you won't make it out of this town alive." Without another word, Michael grabbed the folder and stood, leaving the diner with more questions than answers. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but there was no turning back. He had made a decision, and now he had to face the consequences. As Michael drove back to the precinct, the weight of the information in the folder felt like a leaden anchor around his neck. He had always believed in justice, in doing what was right. But now, the lines between right and wrong had blurred so much that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Michael had been given a choice: stop digging, and everything would go back to normal. But if he chose to follow this path, to uncover the truth, he knew he would be up against forces far greater than anything he had ever imagined. The folder was heavy in his hands, and as he opened it, Michael felt a chill run down his spine. Inside were photos, documents, and messages that painted a picture of corruption, manipulation, and murder, evidence that could take down not just Officer Harris, but Commissioner Green himself. And as Michael leafed through the pages, a terrifying thought settled in his mind: if this information ever made it into the wrong hands, the consequences would be catastrophic. The town, the department, everything he had worked for, would crumble. And yet, if he didn't act on it, if he didn't expose the truth, he would become complicit in the very corruption he had sworn to fight against. With his heart pounding in his chest, Michael made a decision. He would confront Green. He would bring everything to light, no matter the cost. The choice was clear now: he could live with the truth, or he could let the lies destroy him, and everything around him. But there was one thing Michael knew for certain: this was no longer just about him. This was about the future of Westbridge, and it was time to make sure that future was no longer controlled by the shadows. The night before his confrontation with Commissioner Green, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the precipice of something irreversible. The weight of the documents in the folder still felt heavy in his hands, as if they carried the potential to destroy not only Green but the very fabric of the town he had lived in for his entire life. Westbridge was a place where trust was once a commodity, where the police force stood as the pillar of safety and integrity. But now, it was all fractured, broken under the pressure of greed, corruption, and power. Michael had known something was off for a while, but he hadn't fully understood the depths to which the rot had spread. Now, with the truth in his hands, he realized that the very foundation of his world was built on lies. His phone buzzed on the bedside table, pulling him from his thoughts. The text was from an unknown number, but Michael didn't hesitate to open it. "Meet me at the old warehouse on Miller's Dock. 8 p.m. Come alone." The message was brief, chilling in its simplicity. The source of the message wasn't clear, but it didn't matter. He had already made up his mind. He had no choice now but to move forward. The warehouse at Miller's Dock was a place Michael had passed countless times without giving it a second thought. A decaying relic from the town's industrial past, it had long since fallen into disuse. It stood in the shadows of the docks, forgotten by most, save for the few who still remembered its once meaningful place in Westbridge's history. It was the kind of place that seemed to hide secrets, and it made sense that he would be called here. His heart raced as he approached the old building, its rusted gates and broken windows casting long, eerie shadows in the dimming light of evening. As he stepped inside, the air was thick with the smell of saltwater and mildew, and the distant sound of waves crashing against the docks added an ominous undertone to the scene. He couldn't shake the sense that he was being watched, though he couldn't see anyone. The silence was deafening. "Michael," a voice called out from the shadows, startling him. He spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon, but he quickly lowered it when he saw the figure stepping into the weak light. It was Lieutenant Harris. "You shouldn't be here," Michael said, his voice tight with both confusion and anger. Harris was the last person he expected to see. The man had been missing for days, and now here he was, standing in front of him like nothing had ever happened. But Harris didn't seem like the man Michael had once trusted. His eyes were tired, his movements stiff, as if he were carrying a heavy burden. "You need to listen to me," Harris said, his voice low and strained. "It's not what you think. Green, he's been playing us all along. He's been orchestrating everything from the beginning." Michael felt the weight of Harris's words settle over him. He had already suspected that Green was involved in something more sinister than anyone had realized, but hearing it from Harris himself was a stark reminder of how deep the corruption ran. Harris was not an innocent bystander in all of this. He had been complicit, just like the others, but now, it seemed that he was trying to make amends, or at least warn Michael of what was to come. "Why should I believe you?" Michael asked, still unsure of where Harris's loyalties lay. "You disappeared. You've been hiding. What's your game?" Harris's face twisted with guilt, and he took a step forward. "I had to disappear. They were going to kill me if I didn't. Green, he's not just the commissioner. He's connected to people you wouldn't believe. This isn't just about us anymore, Michael. This is about a much larger network, one that controls everything. Westbridge is just a pawn in a much bigger game. Michael felt the blood drain from his face. What are you saying? This goes beyond the department, beyond the town? Harris nodded grimly. Exactly. The people pulling the strings aren't just here. They're everywhere. They have their hands in politics, in business, in law enforcement. Green is their frontier in Westbridge, and you, he paused, his eyes flickering with a mix of fear and urgency. You've become a threat to them, Michael. You and Eleanor. That's why they're targeting you both. The words hit Michael like a freight train. Eleanor. He had known she was caught in the middle of something dangerous, but he hadn't realized the full extent of it until now. She wasn't just a pawn, she was a player, too. She had known more than she had let on, and Michael's connection to her had drawn him into this tangled web of corruption and deceit. Everything he had trusted, everything he had believed in, had been a lie. And now, he had a decision to make: continue to fight, risking everything, or walk away and save himself from the oncoming storm. Before Michael could respond, the sharp sound of footsteps echoed in the warehouse, and a shadow moved across the dim light. He turned quickly, instinctively reaching for his gun, but a voice called out, cutting through the tension. Don't even think about it, Thompson. The voice belonged to none other than Commissioner Green. He stepped into the light, his face cold and calculating, his eyes narrowing when they landed on Michael. Green's presence was overpowering, filling the room with a sense of danger and authority that left no room for hesitation. Michael's pulse quickened, his fingers twitching near his weapon. But Green raised a hand, signaling for him to stay still. This is bigger than you, Thompson, Green said, his tone dripping with authority. You don't understand the forces at play here. If you had any sense, you'd walk away now. Forget everything. Turn a blind eye. This is your last chance to make the right decision. But Michael's resolve had hardened. There was no turning back now. He had seen the truth, and he could no longer be a pawn in Green's game. No, Michael said, his voice steady. I'm not walking away. This town deserves the truth. And I'm going to bring it to light. Green's expression hardened, his eyes darkening with anger. You don't know who you're dealing with, he growled, stepping closer, his voice low and threatening. You think you're the hero here, but you're just a fool. And you're about to make a grave mistake. As Michael stood there, facing the most powerful man in Westbridge, the weight of the moment settled on him. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. He had made a vow to bring justice to the people of this town, and now, it was a matter of survival. His future, his very life, hung in the balance. The battle for the truth had begun, and there was no way to predict how it would end. But one thing was certain: Michael would no longer be silenced. The time for secrets, for lies, was over. The truth would come out, no matter the cost.